It was more of like a snowball where you build that list, you reach out, you figure out the folks who are networked with those companies. We always avoided cold outreach. We felt that cold outreach is just not worth the time. So for the pre-seed, there were a couple of angels who I would call super angels who really opened up their network, really got behind us. And the telltale sign, whether a VC is on your inner circle or your outer circle, is how confident are you and how frequently do you go to that VC with bad news? If you never want to go to that VC with bad news, they're not on your inner circle. A new structure that was becoming more popular but tougher from a legal standpoint is where the equity investor gets a prorated allocation on the token. But an even more difficult and founder-friendly approach, it's a pro rata of the insider allocation of the token. It's a big red flag. I would have hated to have seen what thing they would have done that maybe would have been far more detrimental when they're actually on the cap table. Fundraising can sometimes be like dating. You really need to be in tune with how the VC is feeling about the investment. If a VC is not saying yes, then they're saying no. And the sooner you realize that and move on and don't get so hung up on that.
So welcome to the next episode of The Funded. We took a break over the summer and we're back now. We intend to start doing these a little bit more actively. Would love some feedback. Anybody that's been listening to these episodes, any questions that you think we should cover, any other suggestions of how to improve it and how to make this more useful for entrepreneurs, please get in touch with us. Our DMs are open on Twitter, or you can get in touch with us directly, whatever works. So yeah, today we have Kurt, and let's start with a quick introduction. Kurt, maybe tell us a little bit about what your company is about.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so my name's Kurt, and I'm one of the co-founders at Rhinestone. Rhinestone is a company that's working on account abstraction. We're specifically focused on a niche within account abstraction that's called modular smart accounts. And essentially, our mission is to transform the smart account into a developer platform. And essentially what that means is creating the infrastructure, tools, and services to allow developers to essentially build these modules and use these modules at the application layer on top of any existing smart account. So that could be the Safe, Biconomy's Nexus, ZeroDev's kernel, and there's many other smart accounts kind of in development, and we're working super closely with those teams.
Can you tell us, can you give us a quick summary on your latest round? What round was it? Was it seed, pre-seed, A, B? What was the size of the round? What was the lead investor? Whatever you can share, obviously, publicly. Valuation, instrument, was it token or equity or a combination?
Yeah, sure. So we raised 5 mil. The lead investor was 1KX. So we raised, it was an equity round. We raised with a Safe, or in the UK, it's called an ASA, which is very similar to a Safe, pretty much like just takes what a Safe is and applies it to like English law. With a token warrant as well. So like in terms of where we believe value will accrue, like we have a narrative and a story, and part of that includes a token, but it's like fairly unknown. So that token warrant was quite important for investors. And yeah, so 1KX was the lead. And then, we announced this in September, but we had a bunch of other great investors come on board as well. So we had CoinFund, Lattice, who joined us in our pre-seed, Hardcore, who joined us in our pre-seed, of course, Daedalus Angels, which was great to get you guys on board, and a number of other strategics from zkSync, Alchemy, Circle, Cyber. So all in all, it was a great round, and super happy to get that closed out and get focused on building again.
Cool. And how did you decide on the instrument? I mean, an ASA is obviously quite a UK specific instrument. How did you decide to raise on an ASA? Was it kind of driven by investors? Was it sort of your lawyers suggesting it? What was the decision-making process there?
Yeah. So I think the first big decision is, are you like raising in a more traditional sense using equity as your primary instrument, or are you going down the token path? For us, that question was like pretty easy because it's quite unknown for us how we're going to use a token in our ecosystem. Although we have certain ideas and things that we've discussed with investors, it's still more of and this is how 1KX likes to frame it, which I think is nice. It's still a bit of like a castle in the sky, something that will come later and be very important. But for now, where the most important thing is to raise cash and to start building. And so equity was chosen as the primary instrument. And then when it came to an ASA or a SAFE versus issuing equity and doing a priced round, that was primarily driven by investors. We were open to both approaches. Both approaches have pros and cons. I would say like the pros of an ASA or a SAFE is that it is just a lot faster. It's just, you know, the structuring is far more simple. You essentially delay a lot of decisions around how the equity investment for those investors will look like to when you actually do the priced round. You don't have to set up a board. So there's a lot of things around on like the admin side that you can avoid, which can allow you to continue to like ship faster and move without all these kind of you know, these admin components that can be introduced once you actually do start issuing equity. And so we were open to both approaches, but we were leaning a little bit more towards the SAFE for those reasons. And our investors were on board with that. They were happy. And so that was like the specific equity instrument we landed on. And then, yeah, the token warrant, which was like a big component of like the structuring and how we, like I guess the negotiations around what the investment would look like, because there's just like so many different ways that you can approach the token warrant, and depending on where investors believe value will accrue, they'll either be very focused on the equity terms or very focused on the token warrant terms, or focused on both.
Makes sense. And Kurt, how did you decide that it was the right time to raise capital at this stage? Was it driven by need for cash? Was it driven by improving market conditions? What was the thinking process that you went through?
Yeah, so we've been like relatively conservative when approaching like when is the right time to raise. And what I mean by that is we've always focused on the mission and goals, and then working backwards to when is the right time to raise and what is the right amount. Of course, we factor in market conditions a little bit because it does affect valuation and the amount of equity you end up handing over to investors, and how quickly you can get through the process, and those things are super important. But we mainly start from goals and mission and then work backwards to like needs in terms of resources and the team, etc. When we raised pre-seed, it was 3 of us. It was like the core team. We felt like we had what we needed to keep moving quickly and shift and build partnerships and kind of claim like the space that we were essentially building in. And so we raised a very small pre-seed. It was 420 grand. Initially, it was meant to just be angels, but we ended up having VCs come in on that round. So 1KX actually joined us in our pre-seed, and we increased the size of the round slightly. And then when it came to thinking about the seed, the primary motivation was we're now starting to get traction. We've started to release foundational components of what we need to get out into the ecosystem. So if listeners want to go check out like what they were to get a sense of what I mean by that, they were 2 things. So one is the module registry, which is a foundational component of our infrastructure. We started to get major partnerships and interest in adopting that registry. So one proof point that we had was the partnership that we launched with Biconomy, which was the module store, where the underlying infrastructure that was supporting that is the module registry. And then the second point was that we released a standard for modular smart accounts. It was called, it is ERC 7579. It's a minimal standard for modular accounts. And with that standard, we garnered a lot of ecosystem support. And with that, we garnered a lot of support for the tooling and infrastructure that was on our roadmap. And so once we solidified those partnerships, our goals and missions, our goal and mission was starting to level up. And with that level up, we required more capital to build the team, to fund the audits. Like security audits aren't cheap, for the contracts that we were pushing live into production. And so that's what drove the timing. So it was mainly goal and mission oriented, but also keeping an eye on the market and speaking with investors about timing was important, mainly just so that we didn't spend a ton of time focused on the investment round rather than actually building.
Awesome. Yeah. So it sounds like the company hit an inflection point in terms of adoption, recognition, partnerships, and that was the time to scale. So that was, it sounds like that was the kind of the driver around raising the capital.
Yeah, that's definitely right.
Awesome. How did you go about contacting investors? What was your process? Like, did you make a list of people and then go to your kind of existing network and say, who can introduce us to these people? Or what was the process to sort of, outline the investors you wanted to talk to, and then how did you go about actually getting in touch with them?
Yeah. So for the seed round, it did look different to the pre-seed. So I can talk a little bit about both, like depending on what's like interesting to your audience. I would say like the big difference was that for the seed round, we had investors who were very much getting behind us and helping us kind of get those intros and build out that list. In both occasions, we had a target list of investors that we wanted to speak to. And that was mainly around like, who are the investors who have been active in this space, where like our kind of company fits their like general portfolio, and who can kind of potentially provide the best advice around what we're building and network us with the best companies in terms of BD and sales and growth. So in the pre-seed round, we generated that list ourselves, and we're like primarily driving that outreach ourselves. And it was more of like a snowball where you essentially you build that list, you reach out, you figure out the folks who are networked with those companies, or like those angels. We were focused on angels in the beginning, but then a little bit more on the VC side as well. We always avoided cold outreach. We felt that cold outreach is just not worth the time. So once we had the list, it was, well, who are the individuals who are the partners, or who's connected with those people we want to reach, and then finding those people in our network and looking for warm intros. And then in terms of the snowball effect, once you start to have good conversations, you start to build allies, then you can start to tap into to their network, and that becomes like a multiplier on your ability to kind of, I guess, have as many conversations with as many different investors as possible, because it is a bit of a numbers game. And then, so for the pre-seed, there were a couple of angels who I would call like super angels, who like really opened up their network, really got behind us and helped connect us with the right people. They advised us on like the strategy around the round, like what the terms should look like, how big it should be, how willing we should be to increase the size of the round, because at the time, we wanted it to be a small round because we didn't want it to be a long process. We didn't want to get embroiled in lots of DD, etc. But we did have VCs wanting us to do a proper seed round and do a much bigger round. So we resisted that a little bit. And then in the seed round, again, we were more focused on VCs. So we were very strategic around, well, who would be the best VCs to work with, given what we're trying to achieve and the companies we want to work with. We would stack rank them and then go through the same process of speaking with our network and getting introductions.
Did you do any kind of due diligence on the VCs that you wanted to talk to? Did you speak to any of their portfolio companies, and how did you go about that?
Yeah, so most of the due diligence we did, we left. Well, first of all, if there were a VC that was not credible, that we couldn't find like good proof points around, then of course we would do some early DD to know whether the conversations are even worthwhile. We were in a very lucky position where a lot of the VCs we were talking with were very credible VCs who had a track record. And so having those first conversations, we were confident that it was worth the time. It was more of most of the DD we did was more about, well, who should we take on as the lead? Who should we allow to come in as follow-on investors? And for that, we primarily focused on getting insights from other investors that we trust, mainly investors who are already on the cap table or who have already built a relationship with throughout like the investment process. And then a heavy focus on speaking to founders who are like within the portfolio of those VCs. Often you find that when you speak to founders, they have a lot of experience with VCs that are not just on their cap table as well. So if we got introduced, well, first, we asked for introductions to founders. We also did our own like, so VCs will often say, hey, do your DD, and then they'll introduce you to some founders. There's obviously bias there. And so it makes sense to find other founders in their portfolio who they're not suggesting that you speak with. And sometimes it's interesting to try and find founders that have failed and have gone through like really hard times, and often VCs will show their true colors during that time as well. And so hearing those stories from founders where they can actually talk about, you know, periods in the company's life where they've had hard times and who are the VCs they've really gone to, because often, I mean, we've found this, and I've heard this from other founders as well, VCs will tend to fall into two categories. One is your inner circle, and then the other category is your outer circle. And the telltale sign whether a VC is on your inner circle or your outer circle is how confident are you, and how frequently do you go to that VC with bad news. If you never want to go to that VC with bad news, they're not on your inner circle. And so, yeah, speaking to founders and hearing about their relationship with the VC, like, and especially during times of trouble, is super insightful.
This is exactly what we always advise the founders that we work with, is to basically not go for the proposed introductions, but really just kind of do your own due diligence on the portfolio, find the companies that weren't proposed and have a chat with them. And of course, failed founders makes a lot of sense, because you're right. It's because VCs tend to often, you know, focus on their winners, right? And it's a numbers game, as you know, for VCs. Is, you know, every portfolio will have a couple of winners, a couple of average performers, and a bunch of losers, and automatically VCs tend to go towards focusing on the winners. But often, with a lot of, you know, with help, you can turn an average performer into a winner, or even a loser into a winner with the right kind of support and stuff like that. So, you know, I think that definitely isn't healthy to just focus on sort of a couple of the companies. Cool. And did your round end up being oversubscribed, undersubscribed? Where did you end up when you took all of the kind of the desired commits?
Yeah. So yeah, we were lucky that we were heavily oversubscribed. And so once we had chosen our lead investor, I would say that was one of the like choices that we probably spent the most time on when it came to like designing the cap table. But at the end of it, it was just clear that 1KX was the right investor to go with, just given their track record in the wallet space. Like, they've made a number of great investments. You know, there's Safe, there's Wallet Connect, there's Lit Protocol, and also all of those three that I've mentioned do have a token element, which is unique to investments in the wallet space. And then we'd already built a relationship with them, and we knew what we were getting into. We knew the quality of the people that we'd be working with if we went with 1KX. So that was clear. And then, yeah, thankfully we were oversubscribed. And so then the next big decision was, and depending on which founder you speak to, you'll get different advice. And like, I definitely recommend taking the path that you think resonates with you. But we, like, the two paths that often get suggested is take on as many investors as you can. That's like the, stretching it to like the one side of the spectrum. And then the other side of the spectrum is like be super concentrated and really build deep relationships with a small handful of investors. And both approaches have their merit. Like, one is like get as many supporters, help them amplify your brand, help them, like they can help you build out your BD list and your sales, etc. And that can be really beneficial. The flip side of that is that the more people you add to your cap table, the more you have to squeeze them down. And so we found ourselves having a lot of conversations where we were asking investors to, potentially even cut their ask down in half, to say, hey, we'd love to have you in the round, but like, this is how much we can make available to you. And the flip side of that is that they're just less invested. They're less, they're less aligned in terms of wanting you to succeed. Obviously they want you to succeed, but in terms of really getting behind you as like a strong partner, if they wanted to put in, whether it's $1 million and you're saying I can give you an allocation of 500, then obviously their incentive is not the same if you kind of go all in on that relationship. So we didn't want to like try and do both at the same time, because then I think you're not really getting the best of any situation. So we focused on a handful, like a really small number of investors that we wanted to make sure were fully aligned and really like on board as a partner, and they felt like they had real skin in the game that they wanted to have in the game. So that was for like our top investors. And then for strategics, we did really try and squeeze strategics down, and we kept angel investments capped at a certain amount, because we wanted to make sure that we were getting we weren't giving up a specific strategic just because another strategic wanted to take more in the round. So that was really important, and the VCs who came on early were very very helpful in terms of making the connections to the strategics that we should be speaking to, especially on the angel side as well. So so fortunate in that we were oversubscribed, and then the tough game is, well, how do you structure the round such that it can help you the most once you've closed it?
Did you have to cut out people entirely from the round, and how were those conversations? We definitely had to cut out people entirely, and that was so when thinking through, well, who are the 2 or 3 investors that we want to work super closely with and make sure they have the exposure that makes them really happy. There's only so many that you can do on that front, and so there were some VCs that offered term sheets that we turned down, and we couldn't give them a follow-up investment that was sizable enough to make it worthwhile. And then there were some strategics who also had like a high minimum on what they would like to put in order to get on the cap table. And some strategics we really wanted to get on board because we really wanted to work super closely with them, because we felt like the synergies were very tight and made a lot of sense. Some other strategics, the synergies were a little bit more kind of opaque and we were unsure about, and so there were some that we cut ties with, and we said, look, this is probably not going to work given the exposure that you're after. Cool. Yeah, we find when we talk to founders, we find that the process of having to cut people out of the round or reduce their allocation tends to be quite a stressful experience. I mean, obviously being oversubscribed is a good problem to have, and everybody wants to have that problem. But the conversation of having to tell someone, sorry, we can't take you into the round, especially if you've kind of worked with them or you've known them for some time, it becomes incredibly stressful. And
it is stressful. And I would say the conversation is probably the easy part, and that sounds like maybe a little bit rough, because obviously those conversations are not nice. I would say the hard part is probably, and I think this is what you're alluding to, is once you've made the call and you've told them like you don't have space for them, you are breaking ties a little bit. And one thing that I talk a lot about with founders when they ask for investment advice is momentum is the best friend you can have during an investment process. And there are lots of things you can do to make sure that you actually do bias your process towards building momentum. But one thing that can break momentum is telling an investor, hey, we don't have space for you, and then having to come back and say, actually, we now do have space for you. Because part of building momentum is maintaining the narrative that we're a hot company, a lot of investors want to invest. And so as soon as you start to break that narrative, then you can, and thankfully this never happened to us, but you can get into a situation where your narrative starts to break. And you sever those ties, and then you can't get that tie back, and maybe having that investor actually come in was important. And so it is stressful because often you significantly delay that conversation because you want to keep that investor kind of reserved, and you have the conversations and you tell them they're in the round and it's all just verbal commits, but and so that's stressful. because you essentially have the round structured, but you haven't gone through the process of having all the documents signed and the money's not wired, and you can't because the allocations are shuffling a little bit. And so the most stressful thing is that like something happens, an investor pulls out, and then everything kind of unravels all at once, and then all of a sudden you're kind of not starting again because obviously you have your lead investor, but it can like significantly slow down your process.
We see that quite a lot in bear markets, of course, where investors tend to sort of drop out of rounds for whatever reason. We've seen some pretty bad behavior, to be fair. Like we've seen investors drop out even after signing paperwork and all of that kind of stuff. And typically that opening you have to fill, right? And the best thing to do is, of course, to go to investors you haven't been able to fit in, but totally can see it from their side. If all of a sudden space opens up, the question is, well, why? What does somebody know that I don't, that has caused them to sort of pull out or whatever? So it's quite an intricate process.
Yeah, exactly.
So the next question I wanted to discuss, you've actually answered it partially, but would love to kind of put the answer together on who are the most helpful people across your rounds. Is there any kind of a specific group? Was it other founders? Was it angels? Was it VCs? Like, who would you kind of classify as, these guys made your round much easier or much smoother or much more improved than it would have been without them?
Yeah, so on this, maybe I'll talk about the seed round and I can allude to the way the differences were on the pre-seed, because I think the big difference between the seed and the pre-seed was that we had investors that were already behind us and helping us push the round forward. So yeah, I'd say the main category is getting an investor on board who can really champion you. So in the pre-seed, it was like this super angel profile that I mentioned that really opened up their network and went above and beyond to ensure that we were speaking to the right people and that things were, just anytime we had a question, they would help out. On the seed round, it was picking the right lead investor. And so 1KX was incredibly helpful when it came to structuring the round and helping us with strategic investors once that initial like lead investment ticket was committed and they were all in. You mentioned founders, and like founders, so other founders are really helpful when it comes to getting advice, getting feedback on whether it's like maybe you want feedback on the pitch, the narrative, kind of how you're approaching like essentially telling that story to investors. That can be incredibly helpful. But getting advice on which VCs are great to work with, which strategics are great to work with, because that can also be, we actually found speaking to strategics could be some of the biggest time wasters because they have some of the slowest internal processes, especially like the larger the strategic is, if it's some major corporate, then there's just a lot of hoops that they need to often jump through as well. So speaking with founders and getting advice on VCs and strategics is really helpful. But yeah, I would mainly just say that like having one or two investors that are really in your corner and really helping when it comes to the networking side of things, back channeling and kind of surfacing information and answering questions, because often VCs will talk to one another. And so if you've got a really credible VC in your corner who is helping kind of with those kind of back channeled questions that VCs often have amongst one another, that can be really helpful as well. So yeah, in our pre-seed, it was an angel. In our seed, it was like existing investors and predominantly 1KX that were really helping structure and promote the round.
Awesome. What was the legal process like? As in, what I'm asking here, I guess, is when you kind of, finalize the composition of the round, did you get the legal docs from the lead investor? Did you have to prepare them and then go backwards and forwards with their counsel? Like a summary, what was that like?
Yeah. So from what I've heard, 1KX is one of the easiest investors to work with when it comes to the legal side of things. They're like relatively founder friendly and like not super specific around like the details of the deal. They obviously have a bunch of things that they do, like to make sure that the details are specific. But from what I've heard, like they are some of the most founder friendly and more relaxed when it comes to this side of things. So, but our experience was the like headline kind of investment document. Our lawyers put that together. The review process for that, so that was the ASA agreement, was very straightforward. The token warrant we inherited from the pre-seed, which we also worked on with 1KX. So that was also really straightforward. But maybe I can talk about the token warrant during the pre-seed round was the most time consuming and probably one of the most difficult documents to put together. So maybe it'd be helpful to talk about that.
Yeah, would be great.
But essentially, there is no token warrant that is kind of known as like the standard for how you approach, tokens this early in the life cycle of a business that may eventually launch a token. So with like the safe, like you have this template that is like battle tested and trialed and everyone kind of trusts it. Token warrants, there's nothing like that. And so we heard a lot of conflicting advice from a lot of trusted advisors around what the right approach would be. And so there was a few different themes that were emerging in 2023 or that were changing. So there was like a very traditional structure where the equity investor gets a very specific ratio of tokens, like maybe it's a 1-for-1, which is very investor friendly, not very founder friendly. Maybe it's a 2-for-1, which essentially means that the investor, if the investor owns 10% of equity, then they would get 5% of the token supply. So that's obviously a little bit more founder friendly because it gives you a little bit more wiggle room around what you can do with those tokens. And obviously places a higher valuation on the token component. But again, it's a very specific formula. It's very rigid. And the reason that investors like that, and it makes a ton of sense, is because it gives them a lot of clarity around, well, what is the token valued at today? And what is the claim I'll have on the token in the future? The other downside for founders is that it also means that as you raise more equity, those early equity investors will not get diluted from a token standpoint. They will still have like the same claim against the token. And so a new structure that was becoming more popular but tougher from a legal standpoint is where the equity investor gets a prorated allocation on the token. But an even more difficult and founder-friendly approach is to not specify what it's a pro rata of the insider allocation of the token. That's important. And if you just say, 50%, so 50% of the token supply goes towards the insiders, that's kind of the same as saying like the 2-for-1 scenario. The difference being that as you raise more equity, equity investors get diluted, and so the pro rata allocation also gets diluted. An even more founder-friendly approach, and when I say founder-friendly, I think the other way to frame it is that it gives you maximum flexibility to do the things that are best for the company and therefore for investors and for founders. The approach that we ended up taking, which was great because there's a lot of unknown around how we're going to use the token in the future, is the token warrant is a pro rata allocation on the insider allocation, and the insider allocation is not set until a future date. And so increasing the insider allocation increases the founder share of the token and the insider, like all insiders, including the investors. And decreasing it obviously has the opposite effect, but it allows you to allocate more tokens towards the community and outsider stakeholders, which can often be better for the business. And so the legal structure around that is quite difficult because there have been versions of these token warrants issued in the past. And founders who are malicious have found ways to get around it and essentially screw early investors. And so what we had to do during our pre-seed, and this was the most expensive part of the fundraising process from a legal perspective, is that we had to bring on credible lawyers. So we worked with Goodwin to give the investors confidence that we were we were structuring the legal document in a way that protected investors and also protected founders and achieved what we wanted to jointly achieve. And then back to the seed, 1KX, they spec'd out the management rights, and there was one other document, but it was all relatively straightforward.
Cool. Yeah, the different token warrants. I think the interesting thing is that at the moment, tokens command a higher valuation because of its. I mean, they get a liquidity premium. Of course, tokens become liquid earlier on, but also in the previous way where they were non-dilutive, you kind of know what you're buying and what percentage of the token supply you have based on your investment, independent of how many rounds the company does. And of course, on the flip side, you're right in saying that if the company gets to a point where they've now done too many rounds and they have allocated too many tokens, they may be reluctant to do another round, which may be the right thing for the company. But if they have no token supply left to do that round, they may be taking decisions that are maybe not best for the company, but just protecting the token allocation. I guess what I wonder about the future is whether the premium on tokens will start to come down, because all of a sudden you take all of these privileges. You take away the fact that they're non-dilutive, you take away the liquidity, the earlier liquidity and stuff like that. So maybe the valuations of tokens will start to trend more towards the valuations of the equity round. But I guess it remains to be seen. I guess on how things develop. What was your timeline from start to finish when you said, okay, let's raise our seed now, until it was actually done and the money was in the bank? Roughly, what was that time?
Yeah, so I think there was about a month process of just planning. So from the decision to be okay, we need to pull the trigger soon, it's feeling like good timing, and the narrative is coming together, the traction is coming together, etc. It was probably about a month of planning and just whether it's structuring the deck and thinking about the size of the round, speaking to investors, building out that contact list, starting to have some early conversations with some investors that are already on the cap table, maybe some lower tier investors to start to feel things out a little bit. And then from the point of, okay, we're raising to then getting the term sheets, was roughly a week. And then from deciding, okay, this is the lead investor, to then having documents signed, my memory might be a little bit off, but I would say it was 2 to 3 weeks, going from making that decision to then having documents signed, and then getting the lead check in the door. So that's one component. And then the second component was, okay, we've got the lead sorted, we have the documentation sorted, we now need to decide who's going to fill in the rest of the round. And obviously this is overlapping, you never do it just in isolated chunks. But the thing that took the most time was finalizing essentially the rest of the cap table, and in particular the strategics. So we had done a lot of work speaking with VCs, and then we then turned our attention to, well, who are the great companies that we want to have on the cap table. So the likes of Circle, Alchemy, Cyber, and then founders of companies who we wanted to work closely with. That took more time, because those conversations did not start until after we had finalized the lead. And so that process maybe took a couple of months, if not a little bit longer, to actually getting the final check-in and closing out the whole round. So that process was quite long, and I mean it's at that stage it's kind of fine because you're not investing a ton of time, because like the majority of the deal components are kind of done and dusted, but it's still quite stressful because you still want to make sure that you bring in those one or two investors like VCs who are following in a very big way, and then you still want to make sure you're getting great strategics on board. So it still takes up a lot of it takes up a bit of time, but it takes up a lot of mental capacity, and so that's like a huge drain. So I'd say the full process was probably just over 3 months, like to really to go from start to fully finish.
Got it. What were the surprises? What happened that maybe you didn't expect or thought that you would have preferred it to play out differently?
So one surprise is coming to mind. It's a funny and very niche story, and I think only a handful of people will really maybe understand why it's a surprise. But so Alchemy ended up investing, and Alchemy was a company that we really butted heads with in the early stages of building out our product. I think as a founder, it's always interesting to have your enemies, because your enemies can help focus you. I think and if Alchemy, specifically the people working at Alchemy heard this, they'd probably laugh as well. But Alchemy was one of those companies for us. It was it was over a few things around the technical standards that were being worked on for modular accounts, and we were having a lot of public debates, but behind the scenes we were very friendly, and we were on the same mission. And they ended up investing, and that was a huge vote of confidence that even though we are going slightly separate directions, at the end of the day, the blockchain space, the crypto space is small. We both were pushing in the same direction, and so rather than it just be words saying we want to collaborate, we want to make sure that what we're building is best for the ecosystem, they actually they put money behind their mouth and got involved in the round. So that was a surprise, and that was quite nice. We did have one other surprise that caught me off guard was we had a smaller VC pull out at the kind of last hour. Once we had finalized the allocations, they pulled out, and that was a surprise because they had come across as being so keen, and that was I think it's really poor form, and we talked about it a little bit early on the call, but it can be if the check size is large, it can be very detrimental to your process. Thankfully it wasn't large. We were very straightforward with our feedback on to that VC, and the way we tackled it was that we were very straightforward and honest with the VCs that we then spoke to about how it affected their allocation. And so at the end of the day, it was a 2-day blip in getting back on track, which was quite nice, but that definitely caught us off guard. And I think in hindsight, it's good, right? Because if a VC is willing to do that, then I think it's it's a big red flag. And if they had have come into the round, I would have hated to have seen what thing they would have done that maybe would have been far more detrimental when they're actually on the cap table. So that was one other surprise, and the two things that come to mind in terms of unhappy surprises. Sorry, the Alchemy thing was a happy surprise, but the other thing I mentioned. But I think the other thing that surprised me was just how, and I've said it a few times, but just how powerful it is to have a specific investor really in your corner, helping push the round forward. So I think doing the early work to build those relationships really pays off in dividends once you actually get down to structuring your round and raising the money. A lot of people talk about it being a numbers game. It is a numbers game. You need to speak to as many investors as you can. For us, the numbers game helped us essentially reach a valuation that was really palatable and allowed us to raise the money we wanted to raise without going through huge dilution. But at the end of the day, we had all those conversations and we still went with 1KX, who were already on the cap table. So it was kind of like, it was a funny one where you kind of felt like maybe you just wasted a ton of time. But it's still important. But yeah, it is a numbers game, but having that one investor who really gets behind you can really be a game changer.
Cool. And the VC that pulled out of interest, did you think the reason they gave you for putting out was valid, or was it just some made up bullshit to just get out of it because they were having other issues? Like, what was the kind of the process?
Yeah. So, I mean, definitely more towards the latter. It was kind of like, just BS, like the way they framed it. Whether it was like hiding something or like, there was like, they had their own truth and the truth they were telling was just BS. Like for full transparency, like their reasoning was, it's been like a bit of time since we initially made the commitment. And over that time, we've become more interested in, pick XYZ hype cycle. So that was, they didn't say pick XYZ hype cycle. They listed, 3 categories. And I was like, oh, wow, I can't believe like those are the things you're leaning into. Whether that was actually true or not is kind of beside the point. It may have been. But yeah, I was just disappointed to see them kind of back out in that way. And I think like maybe to reflect on it, I think reflecting on it, so they're a slightly smaller VC who'd been active in the space that we're building in. They're based in Asia. And that was appealing because they could open the door in terms of developers in Asia looking to build on smart accounts, and they were very active at the application layer. So that was appealing to us, but they weren't the top VC that we wanted to work with. So we squeezed them down incredibly. Like we had really pushed them down below a minimum. And I think going back to my earlier point, like if a VC or any investor has like an amount that they want to invest in and like essentially skin in the game they want to build, that's a really important variable to factor into your decision making, because as you start to deviate from that, like their interests have just become less and less aligned, and that was like probably part of it, and that was probably the part of it that they didn't bring up and they didn't talk about because they want to save face or whatever.
Cool. What would you, if you were to go back in time and do this again, what would you do differently?
That's a really good question. I probably would have started the strategic conversations earlier. I think that just in terms of the velocity of the process, it could have been a lot faster if we had have started those earlier. We were very focused on VCs in the early stage of the conversation and probably not having enough conversations with angels as well. So I think having a more healthy mix there. It is hard though, because you're very focused on just finding that lead investor early on. So maybe that's, those are two things. I don't think they're big things. Like we were very happy with how the process came about. Very happy with the terms, very happy with the investors we were able to bring on board. So yeah, on reflection, like there's not a lot that comes to mind in terms of what we do differently.
Cool. Awesome. Are there any, I mean, obviously we spoke about the VC that dropped out. Are there any other sort of behaviors that you saw from investors that you would like to, you would have preferred to not see?
Yeah. So there are definitely some telltale signs that in crypto that I think you should try and avoid. One is there is a profile of investors that place a lot of focus on the token, and it comes across a little bit predatory. So I really try to steer clear of those profiles as much as possible. And they often try and frame it in a very helpful way, like, hey, like, let's get into the tokenomics. We'd love to help you, like, figure out how this is going to work. But you can't force a token. Like, you really need to focus on finding product market fit. That's the thing that matters. So that's definitely a behavior that I try to avoid as much as possible if you can. It is tough, but like, also when VCs become too focused on the deal, that can be like slightly frustrating. Like, you want to go in on this thing feeling like it's a true partnership, and like, we fully understand the game that VCs are playing and why they need to be focused on the deal. But that can also be a little bit tiring, and maybe I'm just really privileged that I've been able to work with investors that are great on this front. But yeah, that would be another thing. But yeah, overall, like, my experience with VCs was positive. I guess one other thing to call out, and maybe this is not like a behavioral critique on VCs, but maybe just like something to note to founders who are raising, is that VCs never say no. They just don't say yes. Like, sometimes people find this hard to really like grasp. And so you really need to be in tune with how the VC is feeling about the investment, the way that they're talking to you over text, how much urgency they're moving with, what are their like kind of like emotional responses and visual cues on calls, I think is really important. And this kind of goes to another thing that I often bring up with founders who are asking for advice, which is that fundraising can sometimes be like dating, because like, you really need to be in tune with how the VC is feeling about the investment. So if a VC is not saying yes, then they're saying no. And the sooner you realize that and move on and don't get so hung up on that is really important. I would love to VCs be more blunt with their feedback, and some VCs are, and that's great. But I also understand that, they want to keep their options open, and that's the part of the game that they need to play as well. And the sooner you realize it's a game, and you start playing the game, the more you kind of tilt things in your direction to win the game.
It's all about optionality, right? That's the only reason they do it. They want to keep their options open. They want to see who else comes in the round. They want to see who the lead ends up being. I mean, in my career as an angel and as a VC as well, I've always tried to be quite open with founders, right? If I'm not able to say no because I want to see who the lead is, typically it's because I've seen some really bad funds out in our space, and I simply don't want to invest if one of those funds is leading, right? Because I know that they lead the company down the wrong path. I know that they give the wrong advice. I've seen good companies turn bad based on a bad lead. And so often, if I'm not looking to lead, for example, I would still want to know who the lead is before I'm, fully ready to commit. Specifically for that reason, not because I want to go after certain funds, but more because I don't want to go after certain funds. If there's a list of funds, and I think they're well known in the industry, by the way. If they're leading, typically a lot of the investors would probably prefer not to go behind them. But yeah, there's a saying in the industry, I guess, a quick no is much better than a protracted maybe, which is what typically some of the funds tend to do. Kurt, one last question from me, and I will let you go. Is there any advice, like anybody considering a fundraise right now? Like, is there any sort of quick-fire advice that you can give them?
I would say the biggest thing is plan and be super deliberate with your process. Don't feel like, I should raise because that's the thing you do. Like, if you can keep building and you can focus on building that traction, then planning and being really deliberate with why you're going to the market, why you're raising the amount of money you're raising, is super important. Not because it it really ensures that you have a narrative that's very compelling to investors and comes across from like a point of strength. But also it allows you to move really fast. Because the worst thing you can do is start the process and get stuck raising for 6 to 9 months. And I've spoken to founders that get stuck raising for 6 to 9 months. It never pans out the way they want it to do, the way they want it to pan out. They always end up raising less money than they need. And then they always end up starting another round 3 months later. And before you know it, you spend your whole career as a founder spending way too much time fundraising and not enough time building. So I think planning and being super deliberate with that number is really important. And it obviously depends on like your position. But if you're not in a position where like the thing you're building is not like part of the hype, and it's not like you're not the founder that is literally leading the innovation, maybe you're following a little bit, then I think like try to find strengths in other areas where like maybe you're just someone who can ship and be incredibly reliable, and that just means you're raising less cash and you're structuring your round in a slightly different way. So I think being really cognizant of like what your company is and where you're positioned in the market and why you need to raise money, and doing that planning up front and figuring out who your investors are, and then being really deliberate when you press the button to go, in like then really committing and making sure you like build a ton of momentum in closing that out as quickly as possible.
Awesome. Kurt, thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time. I think we got some great content here.